Today we talk about another P, one of the 6 retailing Ps, and that P is product. Chapters 12 and 13 are all about the product part of the strategic retailing plan. And we begin that conversation with looking at merchandise management, what that is, and what types of merchandise a retailer has when they're deciding what to bring into their store. So let's define merchandise management, which is the process by which the retailer attempts to offer the appropriate quantity of the right merchandise. Buyers have to be in touch with what the customers want to buy, but one of the most important skills they need is the ability to analyze sales data, analyze it constantly, and be able to make appropriate adjustments along the way. So let's first talk about the 2 different types of merchandise that a retailer can offer in their store. There's really 3, but we're going to talk about the big 2. And the first would be staple merchandise. So staple merchandise categories are categories that are continuously in demand over an extended period of time. So these are things that aren't going to go out of style. They are always going to be needed by consumers. So some things that we would consider to be staple merchandise might be copy paper, men's underwear, basic camis, basic t-shirts, because these are things that are always going to be on the shelf. So the demand is very consistent. So staple merchandise is very predictable, which makes it very easy to forecast demand. We can look at how much copy paper is purchased during a particular week of the year and generally assume that that copy paper demand is going to be the same for the next year. And even if a mistake is made and too much copy paper is ordered, the retailer is going to be able to store it in their warehouse or distribution center and then sell it the next week or the next month without having any repercussions that are negative. So they won't have to discount it for the customers, or they won't have to throw it away because it expires. So these are things that are always going to be needed. And so planning for staple merchandise revolves around what we call a continuous replenishment. And so this means that the computer system, that information systems we looked at in Chapter 10, they're continuously monitoring the merchandise sales. And so they're able to generate replacement orders of staple merchandise automatically when inventory drops below a predetermined level. So you can open up the discussion boards in Chapter 12 and see if you can identify different staple merchandise categories, and you can explain why you think that those would be considered staple. The other merchandise category is fashion merchandise categories. Your book talks about seasonal merchandise, but we're going to group those together. So fashion and season merchandise tend to act the same way. And so fashion merchandise categories are only in demand for a short period of time. And so fashion products are new products that generally are continuously introduced. And when the new product is introduced, an existing product becomes obsolete. So some examples of this would be women's apparel or women's shoes. So they're only in fashion for one season or one year, and then new styles, new colors, new designs come out that are different. Another example would be electronics. Electronics are in the fashion merchandise category because they do go out of style or become obsolete as new technology is introduced. So an example would be the iPhone. So even though an iPhone 5 might still work perfectly and have every functionality that a person might need, consumers are going to buy the 6, 7, 8, and 10 as they come out because they want that latest technology. So with fashion merchandise, forecasting becomes much more difficult because the errors become much more costly to the retailer. So let's think about the iPhone, and let's think about that as an example for the fashion merchandise category. If a buyer orders too many and the let's say Best Buy ends up having 100 extra iPhone 5s when the new iPhone comes out. I guess I should move beyond iPhone 5. Let's say Best Buy ends up with 100 extra iPhone 10s, and the new iPhone is getting ready to come out, they're going to have to sell all of that excess stock at a discount. And that way they can move it out of the store to make room. And so the retailer there is going to actually lose some money on that product because they have to discount it. Now, on the other hand, if they order too few of the newest iPhone and the demand is greater than what they ordered, they're also going to lose sales because customers are going to go elsewhere to get the product. So the goal with fashion merchandise is to be as close to out of stock as possible at the same time that the SKU moves out of fashion. So it's really a lot trickier when placing orders and forecasting. And we'll talk about the details of forecasting as we move forward in this chapter. Now, we do group seasonal merchandise categories along with fashion merchandise because you have all the same repercussions if you order too much or too little. So think of a snow shovel, for example. If Lowe's orders 100 snow shovels and it doesn't snow this year, they're going to have 100 snow shovels sitting in their warehouse that they have to do something with. On the other hand, it hardly ever snows in Georgia. So let's say in central Georgia or South Georgia. So let's say Lowe's doesn't order any snow shovels and suddenly we have 3 inches of snow. What are people going to do? They're not going to be able to buy a snow shovel. So it can make it really tricky. So when you go into the discussion board, also think about different products that you would consider to be fashion merchandise or seasonal merchandise and explain why you think that those products fall into that category. So now that we know that there are staple merchandise categories and fashion merchandise categories, we're going to move into talking about how the merchandise planning process works. And the merchandise planning process, this is based on Exhibit 12.3 in your textbook, so you can see it all in one diagram. This is how we're going to talk about the planning process for buying products. And one thing for you to keep in mind is that these aren't necessarily sequential steps. So a lot of these decisions are being made at the same time, but we are going to walk through it in a sequential process just so you understand generally how it works. So let's start with the very first step here, and that would be forecasting category sales. So when we forecast category sales, the process is a little bit different for staple merchandise than fashion merchandise. So we'll think of those separately. And we're going to start by talking about staple merchandise categories. If I want to predict how many products we're going to sell, my goal here is to use past sales trends to predict future sales trends and making a few adjustments as needed. And so I'm going to start by using my historical sales data. So sales of staple merchandise, like we already talked about, remains constant for the most part. So it's easy to look at last year and see how many sales we made in that same month that we are forecasting for this year. So we think about our white copy paper from Staples. That's a very basic product, a staple product that's going to be in about constant demand. So if I want to know how many reams of paper to order for next October or this coming October, I'll look at last October and see how many I sold then. Now, there's a few things that I have to consider. There's a couple controllable elements here. The first is pricing. So let's say I'm trying to place an order for this October. I'm going to look at whether or not the price of copy paper has gone up. Because if the price of copy paper has gone up, I might need to adjust my forecast down to control for that. I might look at last October's sales and see that we had a promotion running at that time. So maybe I had a buy one, get one free promotion running last October that I don't plan to do this October. If that's the case, then I'll also need to forecast down because I gave away all the free reams of paper last fall. So those are things I can control, pricing and promotion. There's a couple of uncontrollable factors that as a merchandise buyer, I have to be aware of as well. And the first is economic conditions. So I might look and see that, last year we were coming out of a recession, but this year businesses are spending more money on office supplies. So that might mean that I need to increase my forecast to make up for that extra demand. Weather can be a factor, not so much with copy paper, but let's think about a product like paint, right? So I used to work in the paint industry, and weather was a huge factor for us when we were forecasting. Rainy season is a bit unpredictable, and October is a good month to talk about unpredictable rainy weather. So we might look back at last October, and it might have been beautiful weather. Every day was sunny, and so our sales were very high. But something that's uncontrollable is what the weather's going to be like this October. So I might have to place an order now for October, 2 or 3 months ahead, but I have no idea if it's going to be raining or snowing or sunny. So that can impact your sales as well. The last uncontrollable factor would be your competitors. So you have no idea what your competitors are going to do. So again, if you think about, let's go back to our copy paper, and let's say I'm Staples. What happens if I order all of my reams of paper based on last year's sales, and suddenly this October, Office Max runs a buy one, get one free sale? Well, customers are probably going to buy the copy paper there, and I'm going to end up with a lot extra. So to wrap it up, there are a lot of factors that impact ordering your staple merchandise. So even though you think it's, it starts as simply as looking at the historical forecast, there's a lot of things that you have to adjust for along the way as well. Now, let's talk about forecasting fashion merchandise categories. I know you love that fashion there. We know forecasting fashion merchandise is a lot more challenging. And not only is it challenging because, there's nothing to base that forecast off of. One thing that makes it challenging is that fashion merchandise needs to be ordered 3 to 4 months in advance in order to allow for production of that merchandise. So there's little to no opportunity to increase or decrease your order once it's been placed. A lot of times with things like apparel or shoes or electronics, it's made to order. So as all the companies place their orders, the manufacturer makes it at one time. So that can make it tricky. The other thing is that there is not historical sales data. So merchandise buyers have to be, have to consider other ways to forecast sales. So one thing that they might rely on are previous sales for similar categories. So let's consider women's flip-flops. We know that women's flip-flops change in style every year, but women's flip-flops are generally sold every summer. So what we could do is use the total number of women's sandals sold last year in order to predict the number of sales we're going to have this year. Now, it's not exact because the style, the colors, the sizes, they're not the same, but it can get us pretty close. Another thing that buyers rely on when they are forecasting for fashion merchandise is market research. So merchandise buyers read fashion blogs, they search the internet just like consumers do. They look at pop culture, what people are wearing in the movies, what celebrities are wearing in magazines. They're monitoring Pinterest and Facebook and Instagram. And so they're looking at popular fashion through research. Buyers also use more traditional forms of research, such as interviews and focus groups, but market research is a big way to help predict fashion merchandise. Some buyers will use fashion and trend services. So there are companies out there that collect data. So instead of doing your own market research, you can use one of these fashion and trend service companies that are going to collect all the information and tell you what's going to be in style, how much consumers are going to want to buy, and help you predict how many you should order. And then the last thing that fashion merchandise buyers rely on to help forecast sales is vendor expertise. So this goes back to our strong relationship with our suppliers. Fashion vendors, of course, are going to do their own research before they start to produce merchandise. So depending on your relationship with your suppliers, you can often get data and information from them to help you make a decision on how much you should order. And that gets a little tricky because if you don't have a strong relationship, you can't trust necessarily that your vendor is giving you accurate information, because at the end of the day, they want to sell the product that they're making. And so this vendor expertise works best when you do have very strong relationships with your suppliers. So step one, right? Forecasting category sales. For staple merchandise, we can rely on historical data. For fashion merchandise, we rely on all of the things on this list we just discussed. There's one more thing we need to talk about in terms of forecasting, and that is forecasting for services. So staple merchandise and fashion merchandise, those are all physical items that consumers can buy. But what about services? We know that services perish at the end of the day. And so they are even harder to forecast for than fashion merchandise. So if I am a doctor, how do I know, how many appointments I should make in a day? If I'm an airplane, how do I make sure that I sell all of my seats? If I'm a restaurant, how do I make sure that I fill all of my tables for the evening? Well, there's a few things that service retailers do to try to predict sales. So they rely on overbooking. Doctors overbook appointments. So they might have 10 slots for the day, but they're going to book 13 appointments, anticipating that 2 to 3 people are going to cancel. That way, they know for sure that they don't have any wasted time. Airplanes often overbook flights. So if you've ever been on standby, it's because your flight's actually been overbooked. So the airline is anticipating that some people are not going to make the flight, so they'll still be able to have a full plane, even if a few people miss the flight. So the service retailers also can rely on reservations. So restaurants require reservations, and popular restaurants require reservations, enough time in advance. And so therefore they know how many people are going to be coming to the restaurant on a given night, and they can try to ensure that they have all of the tables booked for all of the hours that they're open. Another way to predict service sales is through advance tickets. Concerts often sell advance tickets. So if you've ever bought pre-sale tickets, that is a way that you are helping that service retailer forecast. So that venue is only going to have the concert if a certain percentage of tickets sell in the pre-sale, because that pre-sale can predict how many tickets are going to sell before the event actually happens. So forecasting is different for staple merchandise, fashion merchandise, and services. So make sure you know how retailers forecast sales. And remember that most retailers are going to sell services, they're going to sell staple merchandise, and they're also going to sell fashion merchandise. So forecasting is difficult because not only do you have to understand how to forecast for each category, you are putting a plan in that's going to cover all of those different products and service categories. So that's a detailed look at step one of the merchandise buying process, forecasting. Our next couple of videos will walk through the remainder of the steps in the process.